No.
Looks like the link that the Facebook group sent was empty, but the email one was correct.
Don't save. No, I don't want you to save anything. I just want you to shut off.
Don't talk to me like that, Trip.
No, I'm talking to all the programs that children had open on my computer. It's like, I don't want all of these. All right. So the link that the face group sent was to empty? What? Curse you in this internet world. All right. Copy invite link. I'll go put it in the Facebook group. But I believe it's already on Facebook. Yeah. All right. We are on Facebook. See? So we can just share that.
Oh, yeah. Wait.
Discussion. Add post. Boom. All right. Now, yeah.
Hosted a process party.
There we go. There we go. So I have this new. Who knows if how this is going to work? I got this new contraption that pulls all the comments where people respond on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube onto my phone. So
holy buckets.
So y'all don't have to watch the comments. So if you I'll be the DJ of sorts to all the excitement. Now let me pull up that. Excellent. Boom. All right. Well, look at it. We have some interesting things on the feed already. Oh, Lee Rambo. Their cameras not working. Yes. Well, so before I hit record this, then I don't have to edit it out. On the Facebook group and everything, and I'll put the link in the chat, or if somebody has the link to the chat to the discussion, the different quotes and such that we will be. Come on, you were just telling me about my event, Facebook. There we go. I know I left it in here. I'll grab this PDF. It has a host of different selections, different Facebook, half the world on it. But what's something else that half the world's on? Yes, I want to follow the link. Are you sure you want to go away from Facebook? Can't we just keep your attention forever? All right, here's there's the link to the thingy-mabob. All right. Yeah, so we will so they can't chat with each other. Is that what it's also saying? So y'all don't see the chats?
We see the chats. I don't think that's what they were saying.
But they can't see the chats.
No, they can't. They can't DM each other personally, but they can only DM everybody or the panelists, is what I think they're saying.
Oh, they can't send private messages. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how to. I think it's because it's in the webinar thing, which then I can have more people on, and it go to all the things. But yeah, you'll have to distract each other by using other social media to message each other. Yeah. Okay. So this was an experimental idea that may or may not end up working out. But I was like, we should have an interactive process party on the interwebs. So part one, my friends Tim and Jake, they picked a number of different quotes that are in the PDF that you have linked. We will be using those to frame the first part of the conversation. I'll be asking them questions and such. A number of you sent in questions and things before, which I will either weave in or ask after we talk about the the different quotes and stuff. And then after about halfway through, then depending on what kind of mood y'all are in, then we're going to attempt pulling people up, and you're going to give your process hot take, and then we'll discuss it. If it's based on one of the quotes, even more fun. If it's a hot take and you want to ask a question and force one of them to answer it or discuss it or something like that. I was discussing how to I calling it hot take because I'm going to time it, because I don't know how not to be mean and not to like get bogarted, but it's like at AAR, when someone asks a question at an event and then the next thing you know, it's 6 minutes later and you're like, you talk longer than the panelists. And so in lieu of that possibly happening, I'm just going to time it for a 90-second hot take. And whatever you say in your 90 seconds, then we have to make sense of before we pull someone else up. If it doesn't work at all, then we'll change, but that's what we're going to attempt in the second half. So the idea was the first half, I know I won't require a ton of editing to use for the podcast. The second half could be, who knows what kind of party you're at, because Jake and I, it's later. Are you in Montana, Jake? Did you go back?
Montana?
No, Dakota.
Thank you. No, I'm still in Dublin. I'm here. We're on the last week of teaching term, so.
Oh, okay. Sweet. All right. Yeah. Now I'm going to hit record. And I think we will see how this goes. Excellent. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and this is our first attempt at a live process party online. If you're hearing this, it's because it wasn't so derailed that it could be turned into something to be recorded. If you're participating live, I can guarantee things will happen that will never be put on the internet. And that's because, look, there's no party like a process party, and process parties are really not really fit unedited on the internet. So what we're going to do today is I'm joined by two process party friends of mine, and they have selected a whole host of different little quotes, which you can find in the PDF. It's basically everywhere this is streaming, and I'll put it on the page wherever you're watching or listening to this. But the goal for this first one, other than attempting a format, was to introduce you to two of my friends, and then for us to introduce you to some of those zesty lines from process text that got you to go join the process party. So this is a new format. The theme, it's much more introductory. We almost picked real specific niche things, which now I'm really glad I got talked out of it, because I'm looking at a large number of messages people are sending and anticipate this getting wild. So, Tom's not seeing the PDF in the comments on Facebook. It is in the Facebook group, Tom, or the event page. But when they're introducing themselves, I'll paste it in there. All right. So what I'm going to do first is I'll let Tim introduce himself briefly, and then let Jake do so, and then we will start partying up. If you're a regular podcast listener, you've met them both at some point. But this is Jake and Tim's first time hanging out. And they both were friends I texted and convinced to attempt this little experiment with me. So with that, I'll let Tim take it away, then Jake, And while you do that, I'll give Tom and company on one of the Facebook feeds the link.
What's up, everybody? My name is Tim Burnett. I curate a community in Santa Barbara, California called Way Collective. We're endeavoring into whatever this posty space is in this time we're all inhabiting, creating a community of shared practices and values. So still centering the Christian story, but more open on beliefs and what unites us is a way of life. But I am interested in all things process, definitely a process nerd. I love bringing together process and contemplation. So definitely in the apophatic panentheist crew. Interested in all things mysticism and process. So was able to bring some Katherine Keller into this, and I probably will drop some Faber at some point. And love that my friends here also picked some Whitehead quotes, because you got to go to the source. So looking forward to this conversation and the zest that will ensue from these entanglings today. So thanks for having me. Good to be here.
That's great. I'm Jake Erickson. I'm assistant professor of theological ethics at Trinity College Dublin. I teach theology and environmental ethics. I'm really interested in theopoetics. I'm interested in process theology's long engagement with environmental movements and activism in that way. I'm immensely in love with the sort of emergent theopoetic tradition of process thought and a lot of the stuff that Tim's already mentioned as well. I think there's going to be a lot of resonance in our conversations tonight. So glad to be with y'all.
All right. So one of the parts of the process party was assuming this works out well, is to get different friends to join each time, and then it gets centered on my different friends, like favorite quotes from something process or something process adjacent and related, and that kind of funds the conversation, because the larger community of process not only has people all over the globe, but obviously like someone like Whitehead Hartshorn not going to show up at the process party, so we hopefully will introduce different thinkers, different texts, and such while nerding out. And so my plan is to time our discussion of the text. And here's what I was thinking. Whoever selected that text will read it, and then you'll say, like, why, when you're inviting someone to the process party, why do you want to read this text? And say a bit about it. We'll discuss it. When my phone dings, we'll go to the next one. And that way we get the text. We start going back and forth and such. And and in the Team Faber in the comment section is already getting vicious. So who selected the first one from Cloud of the Impossible? Because I know you both had Katherine selections.
Boom. That was me, I think.
Okay.
So should I read it?
Yeah.
And then you want me to give a little reasoning?
Read it. Okay. Like a little mini invitation, a little like a revival preacher's responding to the word of just Katherine Keller.
JC. Okay. It is a mindful non-knowing that might save us from the name of God. It rescues a space for the uncertainty of our God relation and so of theology. It holds a space for theology. This possible impossibility of theology lets us mind the specific uncertainty of any relation when it matters. We may then attend knowingly to the non-knowing, into which, at each crisis of relation, our non-separable difference plunges us. The truth we then test, the truth we pledge, plies a mindfulness of our interdependence and at the same time a patience, sometimes even a pleasure in its enigmatic excess. I am guessing that right there, in that very fold, cracks open some possibility, however minor, that had appeared as the impossible. Then is activated the ability, posse ipsum, and therefore the response ability to transmute a knotted indeterminacy into a vibrant network. Chaos sifts chiasmically into the chaosmos of all. A bit of world comes unsnarled, but stays entangled.
Oh, the eros of God for the people of God. That's what I'm talking about. All right. So when you're handing out your Just Katherine Keller chick track, trying to bring people to the Lord, and then they get to this, why'd you pick this one?
I think one of the attractions of process philosophy to me is the way that it holds space for sort of rational, empirical and speculative approach to theology, while sort of holding together this non-knowing, as Keller calls it in this passage. And so, I think Whitehead is one of the few philosophers who really shows us what it looks like to create a philosophy of becoming in which there is no abstraction that one can pause and uphold as a snapshot of the all, but rather that there's embedded in the nature of things this non-knowing or this unknowing. And so in my own journey, I've been drawn to more contemplative streams of my own Christian tradition and love the mystics. And so I think, people who really hear Whitehead in this way, especially like Katherine Keller shows here, gets really theopoetical with the invitation to a process perspective. And in that, she creates here I think her own sort of rendering out of the chaosmos. And yeah, I find it infinitely alluring to be in this process of knowing and speaking and unknowing and unsaying. And thus, I think it's just sort of a snapshot of a moment of becoming in such a way that really gives us a potential to open up, and so not stay closed off in a sort of a reductive rationalism. So I find her to be one of those creative voices who, as Jake was saying earlier, theopoetically opens us up to the moreness. And I think from a process perspective, for me, the reason quotes like this are so meaningful is I think that the mystery is precisely the mystery because it always moves beyond itself. And so there's always more knowing. There's a sur-rationality, there's a trans-rationality, there's a multiplicity of relationality that we are invited to endeavor in for the whole of our spatiotemporal lives. And so naming that as this sort of creative saying and unsaying, holding those two things together, I think is vital for somebody who wants to be in the process world. So, yeah.
Well, amen. Jake, I know you have spent a lot of time with Katherine. Like when you hear, and you were with her when she was working on this book, right? So
yeah.
So maybe you can give us an insight, having worked with her and spent time, and also you write as beautiful as she does. It's really irritating for me that people write that pretty. Like when you came and gave a research paper here at University of Edinburgh, normally a research paper, a seminar, you're like, oh, well, this would be something. Well, at least we'll go out after it. And then you started doing the Katherine thing. I'm like, geez, what happened? Why do you write so pretty? And then you pull all the different words, start putting together, and I'm like, oh. Anyway,
can you put like, why do you write so pretty as the blurb for my book?
I know.
I'm as a North Dakotan, I'm super uncomfortable with praise, and so thank you for that. But I'm now really like freaking out. This is yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know about insider knowledge and detail. But this, I mean, I think when Cloud of the Impossible was coming out, like this language of entanglement, as a metaphor or as a way of talking about relationality, and not just relationality in a flat way, but relationality that was, like you were saying, Tim, sort of relations of difference, that every relation that we have is a relation of difference. And it seems to me like that book really just opens up not just a sort of line of thinking, but it opens up all of these differences and relationships that might be somewhat unexpected. And that's kind of the mysterious possibility that happens there. I will take credit for one thing, and that's the cloud cult quote at the beginning of the book. I was the one who gave her that album. So we played it in our research seminar. So it's a good song if you catch them.
Okay, so one of the questions that got sent in, this would be a question interjection, is part of what Katherine's getting at in the text is really a shift from the theologian as wanting to use whatever language, poetical or rather direct language, to grasp and secure a concept of God, and it's actually giving a kind of a piety of not knowing is being described, right? And that it's an invitation to trust the process, the mystery, and all that kind of thing. So one of the questions was, for both of you, is what religious tradition did you grow up in, and when did you get permission to not know but keep seeking? Andrea's question: when did you get the permission to not know and keep seeking from your religious growing up, your background? Because people get to process all sorts of ways. So either one of you feel like
yeah, I'll jump in on that. I feel like so I was in seminary doing my MDiv when I got diagnosed with cancer, and so I had this ideological deconstruction happening, or just trying to integrate new ideas. At the same time, I had this really deep existential experience of suffering and contact with my finitude and mortality. And so very quickly, there was a rupture in my world where I started carrying new questions and asking. I had to read off the prescribed reading lists and have conversations outside of even my seminary in order to keep adventuring. So for me, I know that process is I'm still kind of experiencing the fallout of that, and that's been a process of unknowing a lot of things. I mean, there's this continuation to, I come from the Christian tradition, so I should reiterate that. But for me, this sort of cataphatic, apophatic, what can become like either a new dualism, I don't think necessarily needs to be, and process is an invitation to hold the two in a sort of infinite becoming together. And so I don't think I really had permission to do that until I really started studying process with John Cobb and Faber out at Claremont in my doctoral program, or I didn't really have the language to hold together what the apophatic Christian tradition had been saying with some kind of speculative metaphysic that still engaged science. And so for me, the permission came when I realized that the nature of the entire system, and we might get to this if we ever get to the other Katherine quote that I shared, was that the nature of becoming is such that you always are relationally knowing and unknowing as you adventure on. And so I think that just holding that really gave me permission to then have to learn into a pedagogy of living, into what Faber sometimes calls the peace of passage. How do you find rest in unknowing, and how do you find peace as your life continues to pass on? And still learning into that all the time. It's a sort of receptive surrender, I think. But definitely process sort of gave me language and permission to keep going.
Awesome. So how's our definitely not from Montana, but North Dakota Lutheran?
Yeah.
Jake's answer.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the first I actually do I remember the exact first time that I heard the phrase process theology, and it would have been my sophomore year of college. I think it was 19, and we were in a seminar on enlightenment and contemporary theologies, moving towards and focusing on Christology. And one of the days, the lecturer sort of stopped us in the middle. We'd been reading Bultmann and Tillich and everybody, and he said, "There's this school that you all need to know about, and I'm going to do a day on it." And in the hour and a half that he had, he went through and just sort of buzzed us all with process theology, and everyone was just like kind of um, like entranced, I guess is probably the right word. And I didn't pick it up at the time, really, but it stayed with me, because I like you said, I grew up Lutheran, I grew up ELCA, and I think the ways that my Lutheran heritage talks about like faith as a relationship, and a lot of the thing cherishing forms of mystery and things like that, and a sense of sacramental presence. So all those things really mattered to me. And it wasn't until really in grad school, when a lecturer, again in another classroom, and so this is maybe something to talk about, that we're sort of we've only encountered process theology in academic spaces, right? That a lecturer accidentally miscopied something he'd meant to assign with Katherine Keller's essay "Seeking and Sucking," and that was it was this feminist theology essay, and from that I was just like absolutely enamored, and that's how I heard of her first, and that's how I sort of launched into everything. So it's just a lot of happy accidents, I think, and or happy concrescences or coalescences or intersections or what have you, entangled.
Well, so Jake, you could pick which of the quotes you want to read next, and you can pick someone else's as well, but you get to pick whichever one we read next. And I'll briefly just say, I grew up Baptist and I found process. This has been on so many podcasts. I always feel weird. And then if I don't answer questions, people are like, well, you didn't answer a question. And, but I was in a philosophy of religion class, complained that Aquinas wasn't biblical enough because God obviously changes and suffers, and just start quoting Bible verses. And the professor, who was radically orthodox, said, "Trip, that's process philosophy and it's not compatible with Christianity." And so I went to the library, and Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes by Charles Hartshorne was the shortest book that came up tagged process. And I read it and was like, this seems like a very cruciform metaphysics that I like. And just the desire to argue every day in class meant I just would get articles or find process things. I worked in the library for my work study. I would go find stuff about every topic the rest of the semester, and then just voice it in class. Like, this is my deep held position that I've always had, and just the chance to argue was all I needed. So, I mean, there were other reasons, but Jake, what is the next quote you want us to party on about? You have to unmute yourself though. You're muted. Oh,
There we go.
okay.
Sorry.
That's a kind of unsaying that we're not going for.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm just gonna go for pure apophasis for the rest of the thing. I was distracted. You put my quotes in pink, which is like the best thing ever, and so I'm gonna go for one of those. But I'm actually just gonna go down the line because I think there's good reason to. And it's the Alfred North Whitehead from Process and Reality, and it's the simple one. It is as true to say that God creates the world as the world creates God. so this it's deceptively simple, and it's a bit kind of the radical edge of process thought, but it's what I love about it. And it's this quote that sort of at the end of Process and Reality, Whitehead's going through these lists of these. It is true to say that, as that, and all of these sort of mutual things that we normally think of as opposite, or not necessarily in orthodox mindsets would say to be true of God. And that last section to me just read like a poem and read like a prayer the first time I read it. I think reading Process and Reality, sometimes the language sort of overwhelms people. And this section was just something that was so focused and so true to me. And it's this language of God creates the world as the world creates God. And the first thing that I always felt in that space was that this was one of the most true articulations of a kind of relationship, of any kind of real relationship, that at the heart of anything, that we're always engaged in what process thought would be calling creative transformation or mutual transformation, the sense that we're constantly affected by and affecting that which we're in inextricable relationship to. That's that entangled difference. But it takes it one step further, that it's not just a description of a relationship that is affecting us, but in fact that it's creative. And that's so incredible to me. That everything from our biological selves to our mental and creative selves are always being sort of created by the relationships that we have, and responding and creating over and over again. And that goes all the way through to divinity. And that would be, in the classic language, theopoiesis or poiesis, this creating or making together, but just done in this unique way that Whitehead does. And it's just it's a sentence that seems to me so honestly true about that which I call God, to have that kind of loving sense of relationship, such that it's built in and constantly flowing. So maybe otherwise I'm going to go on.
Oh, I understand the desire to. So one of the things about the end of Process and Reality, which, I feel like there's at some point, if you go process, like once you get to part 5, you're just like, oh, here it comes. It's like when you start like Zeppelin 4, and you're like, I know what's going to happen. Like, at some point I'm going to turn this up, and we have Stairway to Heaven, and you look, everyone's got their copies out. Yeah. See, I don't have, I was working on Modes of Thought, so that's what's sitting here. But one of the things about the it's just true to say, right, around God and the world, as a Christian who read that, having not understood everything he said, but why it stuck out to me, is that I think that if God is revealed in Jesus, then God has refused to be God without us, and that whatever you say about God is tangled up in the fact that God is receiving materiality all the way to its depths, right? And so, like, you can't really say one without the other. And the beauty of that is to say that the otherness of the world is intrinsically definitional to God, because God's investing in the world, and the world responds, and then it reciprocates into God. And it wasn't until later that I read people complaining about process that they were like, this is one of those lines we know it can't be Christian. Because when I read it, I was like, fine, see, I told you. And do either one of you had that response? Because that's one of those lines people will bring up and be like, whoa, this is not good. And when I read it, I'm like, finally, a metaphysic fit for the crucifixion,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I heard it as good news too when I first read it. I think you'd have to read that whole part 5 and skip over Whitehead's critique of the classical tradition, because he already goes into it and talks about why that sort of, the Hellenized form of God that's all down with power is not so hot. You know what I mean? And so like when he starts to, this is the culmination of, his metaphysic that he's been developing for 340 something pages. It's like, and then he goes in and just lambasts the classical notion of God that's in bed with power. And then he gives you this relational, reciprocal, loving. I know we've got a quote later potentially where he talks about the love that passes from the world into God and from God into the world. And like, yeah, you'd have to like not be down with love, I think, to misinterpret that, and which is ludicrous for a Christian, right? Like, or you have to sort of call into question, what is the nature of love? I think somebody's got a book called that. I can't remember who it is. Maybe somebody in the chat. But like, you know what I mean? Is love powerful, or is love relational and vulnerable? And these questions sort of come up. And I think depending on how you interpret the tradition, you sort of move into that process form of vulnerable relationality, or you don't. You want to dig the heels in,
Jake, you're muted again. There you go.
Oh no, no, I wasn't talking. I was just talking to myself. I was saying, yeah.
Oh.
No, I was just no, I think it's also embedded in how folks want to imagine what redemption looks like, right? Because there's this sense in which, and it's odd because it's like this critique of Christianity. Well, how can your God be vulnerable and also saving, or something like that? And I'm like, well, that's what the whole deal is. It's this idea that this vulnerability of relationship and solidarity is precisely what transforms things in different ways, and the risk of that solidarity does. And I think that for a lot of folks, want to envision a sense of this sort of arc of the narrative where everything just works out right. And that's, I get the desire for that. It's a pastoral desire, right? But that, in my mind, that sort of doesn't honor the particularity of who we are in our vulnerabilities. And it doesn't say something about us in all of our messiness as we know we are as well. And I think that God constantly seems to affirm that messiness. God becomes an animal in Orthodox Christian theology, and that's pretty darn weird already, So.
Oh yeah. All right, Tim, you're going to pick the next quote from any of the ones that are on there. And while you look at it, I'm going to ask Jake a question.
Okay.
All right. So Jake, when now that we're all getting vaccines here, when I come to visit you in Ireland, like what dive bar are we going to go to make up for the fact that we were technically neighbors but not allowed to see each other for a year?
Which dive bar?
Like when I come to Dublin.
Yeah. I mean, which one aren't we? I suppose is the
better question. I like that. We don't need the logic of the one imposed on soirees around.
Touché.
No, this is a good thing. I've got a nice pub around the corner that does trad music in the evenings. We also have a BrewDog now, which is one of your and my favorites from Edinburgh. But there's, I think the key for Dublin is that you have to have a Guinness, and and the Guinness tastes different at different places. So I'm going to take you to the one that I think is the best.
I support the best as a live option. Now, tonight,
You're breaking up there, Trev.
Quietizing and typical pizzerias in Redondo Beach. Do what?
Say that again. You broke up a lot. We couldn't hear you.
Oh.
His connection is becoming, it says.
Yeah, my connection's becoming I was just saying that Tim and I spent a lot of time doing process and then opting for the fourth meal of the Pizza Shark Shack in Redondo Beach. Elgin's playing video games that I really hope he's not. They actually have real school tomorrow. It's going to be so exciting. Like, I'm not going to homeschool tomorrow for the first time in a year. It's really thrilling. I'm going to read without being interrupted, but Tim's going to read to us. What's our next quote?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to decide. Maybe y'all can help me. We'll make this a relational. I either want to drop some polyphilia and talk about that Whitehead quote on love from the end of Process and Reality, or we could talk Monica Coleman and do a little process liberation. So
I don't know. I mean, we got the Cole Patrol is in the chats. We have Go Coleman, Processes Liberation. Monica wins.
Let's do Coleman. Let's do it. Okay. God is not impartial or insensitive to experiences of suffering that result from systems of oppression and unjust power relations. As God desires the well-being of all creation, God resists injustice wherever it is found. This is different from the Black theological assertion that God is the God of the oppressed. God is rather the God of all. God is the God of all people and the non-human communities of the world as well. God opposes injustice and oppression, and this constructive move can account for the multivalency of oppression. Yes. So you want me to comment? All right. I'm assuming that's a yes. You're kind of broken up there.
I said just go for it, Tim.
Okay. All right. So one of the critiques that gets lobbed at process theology often is that your God can't do shit, right? Your God can't, your God's not powerful at all. Like, how is God supposed to liberate anybody, And I think Monica handles that really well here. Sort of, to me, this is not a denial of the Black theological assertion that God is the God of the oppressed. It's a yes and comment about the nature of God siding with the oppressed and God as the fellow sufferer who understands, as Whitehead called God. And so for me, I think, especially in this time, sort of late capitalism is rampant in the world. We are, hopefully those of us who are akin to the suffering of those in the West, especially, are attempting to decolonize from white supremacy. I think it's important to talk about, the process relational view of God in relation to the liberation theologies and the traditions that we've inherited. And so for me, the critiques that often get lobbed by liberationists at process people, I think, are usually profound misunderstandings of what process is saying about the nature of God. One way to talk about it metaphysically is that process is liberation. I think somebody might have said that in the chat, like that this lure toward deep beauty, toward harmony, toward complexity and intensity and relationality is always asking questions of justice, because the nature of justice is what is beautiful for both an individual, but also for most in a society. And when you see the rampant white supremacy, the rampant late capitalist abuse of the planet and of the working class and things like that, you've got to see that God's luring us to something better than that. You know what I mean? And so this affirmation that God feels with the systemic oppression and the individuals who are experiencing it, and lures us as a civilization toward the abolition of those systems and the renewal of our communities, both human and non-human alike. I love talking about these topics because, again, I think that there's sometimes critiques that are lobbed at process because of the way in which God acts in Whitehead's scheme. And yet I do think that it's a deeply liberational tradition and can be merged with some of the Black liberation inheritance as well. So that's just one thought on it.
Thanks, Tim. No, I mean, one of the things that, it connects to what you were saying that sticks out to me is, there's a difference between God's fidelity being imperial assurance, right? That the right side wins precisely because God can, pull a trump card. And then the process vision, the judgment of God happens every moment, right? Every moment's received in the divine life because God has deep solidarity, especially with the underside. And it's precisely from knowing the materiality of the entangled web of beauty and injustice that God calls forth possibilities to the next moment. Each moment is valuated, and the next moment's possibilities are valued to each creature as they have ears to hear. So God takes sides every moment towards the flourishing of the network and web of life. And I think that one of the things Monica does, both in that quote, but also in Making Way Out of No Way, really dumb not to get that book and read it, is show how the process vision does in every moment what the liberationist vision wants to see. And he makes that connection. Anyway, I was about to lapse into a sermon. It happens. But Jake, what popped up in your mind?
Well, just, yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful trip. Like, I woven throughout all of Whitehead's stuff is this, I mean, and it's very simple to say, but it's casual for folks who've encountered process. It's radical for others, but just that critique of the omni God. I mean, like that and the ways that is projected into political systems and powers and vice versa, that at the heart and crux of it, like that's a liberative move. And then it goes into this minor scale and major scale simultaneously of every moment in justice. And it's almost like the lure is this constant in your face protester, and this sort of readapting thing that's sort of bringing that judgment. So I love that existential feel that it brings. That you're right. So I'm just yeah. I don't know if I could say anything more than you already did.
Well, it with the other quote Tim about is it's the last quote on there. I'll read it. For the kingdom of heaven is with us today. This is another one from the end of Process and Reality. Get your nappies out to wipe your eyes off. For the kingdom of heaven is with us today. For the love of God for the world. It is the particular providence for particular occasions. What is done in the world is transformed into a reality in heaven, and the reality in heaven passes back into the world. By reason of this reciprocal relation, the love in the world passes into the love in the heavens and floods back again into the world. In this sense, God is a great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. Praise be. That's what I'm talking about. Y'all can decide who talks first. I would just like, this is one of those passages like for the and God, that this is what this is getting at poetically. And the beautiful part to me is the way the end of Process and Reality is a restatement. It's like the metaphysics of the Lord's Prayer: "Kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." Bent, right? Like, anyway, and I think that's how it connects to that, the passage Monica was saying. So, I just got auto-tune.
Yeah,
I've already gone and thrown everyone off the internet in my house. All right, y'all say things. I'm gonna see what's going on.
Tim, how do you understand that fellow sufferer who understands moment?
Well, I I think this has a lot to do with the passingness of things to me. Temporality would be another way to talk about that. And that, you know, from sort of a contemplative vantage point, if you start to see like the move that theosis makes in saying that your truest self is has a divine ground, or your true self is like, you know, my deepest me is God, that kind of sentiment, then what happens is really this experience of God suffering in you. You know what I mean? And I have a difficult time, you know, reading even situations like the cross through a lens where, I mean, because Jesus experiences divine absence in that moment, right? The abandonment. And I have a hard time when people read this and say, you know, well, you always got a little friend there with you suffering, because that's not how it feels. What you feel is the absence of your identity and the nakedness of your humanity in those moments of suffering. And so I think for me, I have to couch those moments in a metaphysics of polyphilia. And so I got to drop a little transpantheism on us right now, because for me, this is where Faber's articulation of what Whitehead is up to in his metaphysic has given me language to talk about how love could still be the ground of a warring multiplicity. You know what I mean? And Faber talks about God as the polyphilic embrace of multiplicity, as namely theoplicity. And so if we are what I sometimes call intimations and instantiations of divine love, if that's what we are, if that's part of the value that grounds the beauty of our becoming, then those moments where we find ourselves in deep suffering and there's no God to be found, I sort of have to lapse into that absence of sensing and feeling through the embodiment of that pain in a way that I trust that even this is an instantiation and intimation of divine love, in its passingness, in this experience of perishability. You know what I mean? And all that comes along with that in the bodily experience. And so for me, holding together a sort of mystical theology of polyphilia as a ground for the human experience, which is chocked full of suffering and pain, it's become a vital thread for me to endure my own. And so I'm, you know, forever indebted to Whitehead and to people like Faber who continue that trajectory. So
Awesome, Tim. Jake, you have a thought you want to share? Also, we just crossed like 125 people on all the different places streaming, so that's cool. We had to make sure we say more, use more processed vocabulary to make it like you just want to click off, just like
just pull off all the technical terms and stuff that go along with it.
Yeah, but the Zoom chat box is most hype.
Yeah, so there's an actual party happening in the Zoom chat box, which is very fun.
Yes,
amen. I'm a Lutheran. When I say amen, it's more like just amen. Yeah. So, no, that's gorgeous. I mean, I think like the suffering, the co-suffering, or not co-suffering, but the fellow sufferer who understands language has always been really precise. It's precise, like it's precise in a way that doesn't, for me, because it could easily turn into something like, in like a moment of suffering, someone says, "Oh, I understand what you're going through," and like it could come across as very facile, like on a divine way. And yet I think there's this way in which, especially because Whitehead uses desire so much, that fellow sufferer who understands is simultaneously this kind of divine solidarity and presence, and it's also at the same time meeting us in our contexts in all of these different, that polyphilia kind of way, that multiply erotic kind of way. I mean, like I like to use epiphany language and theophany language, and Faber goes there as well. That sort of that transpantheistic theophania, this manifestation of divinity, and I really like that a lot, because I think it's, like you said, it's more complex in the sense that it's not just a flattening out of a kind of pure pantheism where everything gets kind of reduced, and then, you know, responding to suffering becomes very flat, but instead a kind of a presence that befuddles us, but it's presence nonetheless, indifference in that way. Where's God during the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, so I have a follow-up question for you, Jake. You know, a lot of your work in thinking through using process relational categories to think through the ecological crisis, God's not just the fellow sufferer who understands for the individual, right, in their worst days, or taking sides in collective liberation for it just within, you know, humanity. God's also the fellow sufferer who understands for other species in process thought because of pan-experientialism and all that kind of stuff. Like, how does that phrase, how do you hear that phrase when you think about your non-human neighbors?
Oh, I think of our context of mass extinctions. I think of the ways that we talk about evolution as struggle. I think about predation. I think about all of these things that are sometimes phrased as natural evils, and I think it does two things for me. Firstly, that the way Whitehead sets up the sense of creativity and divine presence, firstly affirms to me creation as good. It starts with that, because there's this sense in which a lot of Orthodox sort of Christian theologians will read the fall into the ecological world, and to me that's so manipulative of the way that creatures are and interact. Like, you just want lions to be vegetarians. Well, that's, how the heck is that a lion? Or something like that, you know, like, and how is that God creating something and saying it's good? I mean, there's all of these, creativity is indeterminate, it's risky, it's diverse, it involves pain and suffering. But then this fellow sufferer who understands in a non-anthropocentric way expands out. And I think it gives me this kind of language to say that there is nothing in creation that doesn't bear witness to the suffering of others in one way, shape, or form, that doesn't grieve the suffering of others in one way, shape, or form. And there's something of an affirmation of the divine life that none of that is lost. That every bit of pain, every bit of a real world interaction, every bit of creaturely life, everything that human beings are able to articulate and everything that we're not, is somehow remembered in God. And that to me is a much of a better way of articulating what salvation looks like to me than simply saying God's going to make you a tiny little garden in a mall that's called the City of God, and there's going to be maybe some animals there, but we're not quite sure.
But definitely dogs, though, right? Definitely dogs.
Well, I think dogs deserve their own place. They're on a different level than us sometimes.
Yeah. So I guess Tim's picking. You're going to pick the next quote, Tim. So while you're looking to pick,
I think it's Jake's turn.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. Well, I did one and then you did one.
Oh, I picked one because I thought it made sense for the next one. Maybe, but Jake, you picked the Marjorie prayer quote, because we have two questions people send in advance about prayer. I feel like the reciprocity of liberation, life-giving, deep solidarity with suffering in the Monica and Al's quote sets up the Marjorie Suhaki. And you know, before you read, I just want you to know, like, after being pestered by quite a few people to pick, like, I'm pretty sure I qualify as a Suhakian. You know, right? Tim has been harassing me, and
I'm just trying to tell you the truth, Trip. Like you just need to listen to the word of the Lord. You know what I mean?
and I he's like, look, Trip, we deep down you just love Marjorie Suhaki, and it's true. I love Marjorie Suhaki.
Who doesn't, though? Honestly,
Yeah, Team Suhaki is a winner, and also if you ever get a chance to do Suhaki at the Process Summer Institute, then you should do it. It was when I was an undergrad, I went to the Process Summer Institute, and I had the Suhaki Introduction to Process class in the morning, and the John Cobb Jesus class in the middle of the day, and then I had Bob Mesley's Evil and Suffering seminar in the evening, and I ate lunch each day with David Ray Griffin. So it was like by the end of that, I was like, hardcore believer. But Marjorie's intro stuff was good, and it's where she does something like in this quote where something we've all experienced as Christians, and this is one I think why I think this question around the questions around prayer and the quotes so helpful. So many times, the actual lived experience of people of faith, their spiritual experiences, are sitting right here, and then you have like this weird filter based on really bad metaphysics that like their stuff goes through, and there's this like the actual palm of spiritual existence doesn't make it through. That's like less than true, and the things that get through then get hyperbolized into some omni BS, and the next thing you know, you're like, what is prayer? Well, it's like, how I get to agree with God that was elected before all the foundations of the earth and other mumbo jumbo, as opposed to prayer is when you show up to life in its fullest and live in the deepest harmony available to you in that moment with the divine. And if you do so faithfully, it actually opens up deeper reservoirs in the next moment. And that deep reservoir is life everlasting, because you're connecting with the very font and the process of becoming. Jesus, I love Marjorie Suhaki. Anyway, so we can read Marjorie now.
I would come up to that altar. I would come up to that altar, Trip. So
I know I'm once lockdown's over and I get to preach more, I think the podcast will dial back from sermonic asides. But it was Jake picked it. All right.
Yeah.
Go for it,
yeah.
Jake.
Here's Marjorie Suhaki in God's presence. So God is like water flowing throughout the universe, like an ocean touching innumerable shores. The action of those waves is sometimes like a chaotic clash of elements whose terrible dynamism reshapes what is and brings new things to emergence. And the action of those waves is also gentle and quiet, nourishing all forms of existent life. The one form does not contradict the other, nor the varieties in between, for the nature of water is interaction with all elements in its path. Taking the nature of each element into account and the resulting action, God is like water. Yeah. I have to say, I have to say that that's one of my favorite books, surprisingly, in process theology, that In God's Presence book. And I think it's because of the ways that it uses that language in everyday sorts of ways. But I think a lot of what we think of process theology as a kind of more philosophical, theological mode and approach. And then she comes in and writes this language that's so contemplative, so spiritual, so attentive to the ways that are both that divinity is present in the minutia of existence and in the cosmic life of existence as well. And it rings so true to me in my, I'm as a theologian, prayer is a complicated thing for me. And on one hand, some folks end up in talking about the theology of prayer. They end up praying and they just end up giving a long description of God rather than talking to divinity or sort of engaging with divinity. And I think one of these one of this in God's presence moment is just the sort of, for me, who's so in with words every day and teaching and writing, the ability to sort of pull back and be attentive to the ways in which divinity is present and swirling in especially the minutia of life, to me is probably one of the most profound things that that process gives me. I mean, I really do think that this text kind of gave me a sense that process has something really, and maybe this goes to you, Tim, too, that sort of the depth of contemplative practice is really charged in what Whitehead does, even though he's using a lot of this language that might not necessarily preach in a without a lexicon on Sunday, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it reminds me of Mary Oliver. I think it's in A Summer's Day where she writes, I don't know what a prayer is, but I do know how to pay attention, you know, how to fall down in the grass, how to lie down in the grass. And just that sense of reverence, you know, the sense of the sacredness of becoming. And yeah, even in the poem that I shared in the document was one that Faber had our Theopoetics class consider in concert with a film called Solaris. But just this idea, like if you see in every stanza there, the sea is mentioned, and these grand metaphors for the ocean as exemplar of, I think, the multivalency of reality and its becomings and relationality, and this idea that you know, love shall not be lost and death shall have no dominion, even though there's this ocean, you know. I just think that's beautiful, Jake. Thanks for bringing that up. And I hope that I can be prayerful in the way that you say there myself.
Well, I don't know. I think it's like a lifelong learning thing of trying to figure out what, you know, how one connects one's theological reflection to this language. But one thing that I find is that this reminder to sort of completely shut off or shut down and redirect attention in a different way. Suddenly I find my language starting to come back to me in new and unique ways. And maybe that's the poetic piece again, that like, I think that attentiveness, suddenly I have this in kind of that way that apophatic and cataphatic language functions, where, you know, negative theologians will say that you can't talk about God, or God is not. And then all of a sudden, all of this language just kind of explodes for how many differential ways that you can speak about divinity in the world. And I think that that's what Suhaki describes there, for me at least, is kind of an embodied way of manifesting that sort of, or thinking about that negative theological practice, where suddenly my attentiveness is more about attending to the ways that divinity is entangled in my immanent presence. I mean, that language of immanence for me has been way more important at the end of the day than transcendence ever has. And I think one thing that process theology does for me in that is that, say, it gives me the language to, or it recognizes for me the importance that immanence has in my own theological and practiced life. And at the same time, it gives it that kind of cosmic sense. So it doesn't simply like reduce itself to like itty bitty human practices, but suddenly my attentiveness can be redirected in a cosmic way.
Oh, that's good. So this reminds me of one moment in my Suhaki class when I first, like, you know, became a true believer. And she was talking about prayer, and I don't remember what I said, but I remember after the class we were talking as we were walking to lunch at Claremont. And she said she was basically asking me if I wanted to pray before class, because she had different people pray each day. Right. And she's like, do you want to pray? I was like, I don't really know. She's like, no. Like, we don't normally have Southern, like, Baptists at Claremont. And we, like, this group's like down to honor whatever everyone's prayers sound like. And I was like, yeah, but I mean, I guess like I'm not going to say no. And, and so then the next day, like I like written a prayer, which, you know, Baptists, we don't have to write prayers because we just trust the Spirit. But nonetheless, I did because I was worried, you know. And I get done, and she really liked it. She goes, well, you know, I just want to make an observation about prayer. Prayer is when we respond to God at each moment with a yes, please. Now, God is always calling, and then sometimes we start to call, and then sometimes when both sides of an energetic interaction start saying yes, please to each other, things you didn't anticipate at the beginning of the evening happen. And, you know, everyone's sitting there going like, what is supposed to be read into this? And then she says, and that is why, if you're learning how to live like a process theologian, every time you have an orgasm with your partner, you should say, you're welcome to God. And I was like, one, Southerner from the South, Baptist preacher's kid, like uncomfortable. Two, like that's literally like it makes perfect sense, right? Like once you like step back and like how many are these places where the way the desires of God and ours show up and there's this harmony and there's this mutual experience, be it reconciliation, like or like affirmation after shame. There are all these places. There's like these erotic in the deep sense, right? Responses. And she's like, that's what prayer looks like. But the gift of prayer are traditions that give you prayers, right? Of repentance, of reconciliation, or all these type of things, of thinking prayerfully over the liturgical calendar, is to hone us into the fact that all the lives of the people of God in Scripture and all the lives of the people of God who've said these prayers for years and years and years, all those lives were the place God showed up, and so can all of your lives show up. God will show up in all of your life. So the question is, are you going to say yes to the arrival of God, whether, you know, like in whatever situation it is? And I was like, oh my God, I am a process theologian. Like that's literally what I was into, though I'm uncomfortable with the sex example because I thought we don't admit that in public, but nonetheless, I hear what you're saying. And, but I will say, if you don't give the partner a heads up before and just say you're welcome after sex, and if they don't know that you're praying, it's weird.
Are you saying God is sex positive, Trip? Is that what you're trying to say?
I definitely sex positive. The man, the comment section makes this whole thing more endearing. All right, so two questions that people came in related to this that you can pick if you want to answer it or not. But one of the questions was, how does a cataphatic and apophatic tension that gets explored in a constructively fruitful way in process thought play out in one's spiritual life? Where, because so often traditions or and such lean to one towards the other, be it like, oh, we're very into contemplative, blah, 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 or like, you know, we have a prayer book, or trust the Spirit and you speak in it. Like, how do you see the cataphatic apophatic playing out in one's own spiritual practice?
I'll jump in, I guess. So I like Merton a lot, especially when he gets a little phenomenological. And one of the quotes that's been sticking with me for the past few years is, he says, we should not misunderstand the phenomena of life. And the more we analyze it out into strange finalities and complex purposes of our own, the more we involve ourselves in absurdity, sadness, and despair. And he says, if we could just let go of what we think is the meaning of it all, we might be able to join the general dance. And for me, I think there is a time, there is a season for the cataphatic, and there's also a time or a season for the apophatic. I might even be willing to go as far as to say that the phenomena of becoming need no languaging or analysis. They just are, in their own beauty. This is why I kind of what drew me to Whitehead initially was his axiology and his value theory and talking about beauty. I'm just an aesthetically wired person. And when I was like, this whole thing's about aesthetic satisfaction, I was like, shit, that sounds great, So, but generally for me, I think what I sense that I'm trying to do in my own spirituality is be present to the phenomena of becoming beneath or beyond or perhaps betwixt analysis, in the sense of allowing the beauty of nature to be what it is. And I think because, we shouldn't make that a new dualism, but because language is an emergence from relational beings, we tend toward the poetic, we tend toward the expressive, we tend toward wanting to talk. Did you see that thing I just saw? Like, it tasted like this, it smelled like this, it was this color, it had this shape to it. And we do that. And we do that with God, we do that with our divine musings as well. And so I think it's just really, I think we've got to, again, in good Whiteheadian fashion, stray from new bifurcations around the apophatic and the cataphatic, and instead realize when our analysis is becoming abstractive, becoming so rational that it's distracting us from the aesthetic satisfaction and quality of being a creature who's alive in a society of other creatures. And I think when we get that, then the articulations of that, the cataphatic, are play, their creativity, their theopoetics, they're just like Katherine's inspiring poetics and language, and Jake's, as Tripp mentioned earlier, like we get to see theologians who are poets and mystics and can call us to the very boundaries of our language so that we circle back into that apophatic presencing into the phenomena of life. So for me, that's kind of how I love to try to bring those two things together. And, as Faber says, sometimes all language is really a mystical boundary anyways. I think an invitation to that presence that Jake was alluding to in the conversation about prayer too. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would even say that, that it's not, you're right. Like it's not necessarily about language, but I think there's an even more profound way in which the ways that we experience the cataphatic and apophatic are fundamentally about are about our encounters with other bodies and other creatures and other relations, organic and inorganic. Like we tend to talk about theology as like language about, like, are you talking about God as if God is immanent, or are you talking about God in an analogical sort of way? And for me, like, I think theology in its cataphatic and apophatic moves is always about bodies. And that means that then every creature is a cataphatic articulation of divinity in the present. And so when you're encountering another creature, you're fundamentally encountering something that's asserting divinity and also retracting away from you in its divinity and apophasis, something that's fundamentally sort of challenging you with its difference. And then at that level, then suddenly language begins to emerge. But we tend to think about our theological language in such instrumental ways, as if we're like, this is our human tool that we use to talk about God. And I don't think that that's what process allows for. I think it's actually fundamentally something that emerges in our body relationships in societies and democracies of creatures, democratic creatures, and therefore that means that every single interaction and every single contemplation, every single time we encounter something that resists us, that's a simultaneous experience of cataphatic and apophatic divinity in our midst. And that happens fundamentally even down to the ways that we experience our own body and the way that our own body becomes a mystery to us as well. I always think of Annie Dillard and her understandings of intricacy, And also there's a long apophasis, right, where the world, a lot of creatures are gone, and the world itself is a kind of embodied memory of those creatures and those lives, and that becomes a different way of speaking too. So it's about language as bodies and memory in the present, I think, if I can say it like that. But yeah.
No, I think that's really good. And I mean, there's one part about the cataphatic that I think is problematized in a different way presently, that I'm interested in how you think a process vision interprets it. For large portions of human beings that have lived, their cataphatic reservoir was something they shared with most of the people they knew, right? So, I mean, yes, there's a multiplicity of religious traditions across the world, but everybody went to the same cathedral and had the same stained glass, whether which of the religious traditions are around, right? Like, so how does the process vision help you understand the gift a tradition gives with its poetical, mythopoetic structures and such, rituals, liturgies, all these types of things, in ways that actually are a gift to cataphatic language without lapsing into complete relativism or absolutism about that tradition? Like, I find that to be one of the more like excellent parts of process versus the other mainline liberals who attempt to do pluralism on the like with Kant and John Hick and company. It's really boring. But I mean, but if you're thinking of it on the practical ground, how does that reframe the way you two relate to your tradition's very situated cataphatic language, while knowing, like having a bigger speculative metaphysical picture?
I mean, I can say something about Lutheran reformational traditions in the sense that I come from, as I come from a Reformation tradition. We take seriously the sense that traditio is about handing over, and in handing something over, there's always a little bit of a betrayal. That's sort of the phrase, right? And so in that way, I think like the built into my understanding of Reformation traditions is already a sense that of an ongoing cosmos that fundamentally sort of interrogates itself, and therefore is always thinking about what comes next. It also says to me, and this is a queer move, right? And just about the way that you phrased histories and traditions, that for quite a long time, a lot of heterosexist society loved to imagine that queer folks didn't exist, right? And didn't like to imagine that there was that diversity simmering underneath of things. And I think one of the things that kind of process sense of diversity allows me to go to is to say that these traditions, as much as they're arcs and reservoirs of these really beautiful, creative, and different crafts of language and crafts of practices that I can, John Tatamanel uses that language of the spice cupboard, where you sort of pull down different spices and mix them all up in that creative move. Just as much as those traditions produce those really beautiful harmonic crafts, then simultaneously, I can say that also there's a tremendous amount of diversity under the cover of what this tradition is named at. And I can actually look back and see the differences that are percolating even in my own understanding of my history of my tradition and what's been there. I sort of out that in a healthy way.
Awesome. So we have a few people that are going to venture process hot takes. I don't know if this is going to be a good idea or not for the whole experience. We're about to find out. But hold on. I'm trying to bring Dan up here because he said he wanted to do it too. All right. Okay, so we'll go Annie, Tom, and Dan. So unmute yourself at the appointed time, because I don't know how to do all that. And but when before your 90 seconds start, though, you can say like a few seconds like of reference for how you found the process party, something about where you are and stuff. Also, feel free to give a shout out to your social media handles, because I know like people listen to this or watch it later, you want to find more people that are down to process. But Annie, you should turn your camera on, unless you don't have a
No,
camera.
if I can't. Well, I do, but I only have an option for like my audio, not the actual camera.
Oh, really? Well,
Does anybody? I don't know if anybody else does, but
well, I'm gonna fix
I'm
that.
having the same issue.
Okay, well, Annie, just hold on for a second. I'm gonna assume make you a panelist, but that's just dangerous. There's like a whole. All right, see if that works. Can you turn it on now?
yeah, I've been promoted, it says.
Oh, well, it's not every day that you know you've successfully promoted anyone. All right, so why don't you say a bit about yourself, then I will get my very lenient yet hypothetically real stopwatch ready for hot take time with Annie.
Okay, 90 seconds.
No, but you have to introduce yourself first. Your full humanities included before said 90 seconds.
You're right. So yeah, I'm Annie. I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm actually an occupational therapist, teaching on faculty for the Department of Occupational Therapy at Indiana University, and just like reading about theology and philosophy of religion for fun. So that's kind of how I stumbled upon the process party. Is that a good enough intro? Is that fine?
Yeah, no, I mean that's good. It was like the opportunity for free seconds before I count.
Well, I hate talking about myself, so would never use the max time, but it's fine.
All right. But all right, so you have a hot take about death, and I'm just looking forward to hot takes about death, and how much that Tim and Jake and not me will have things to say about it, because I just talked to a 7-year-old about a dead dog that died a year ago, who she woke up crying about it right before this started. And I'm already maxed out about death tonight. So come on, hot death take, Annie.
So I don't know if it's like a take or just me wanting to know your thoughts on subjective. So I'm going to pose it like two ways, because this might be too on the spot. So one is going to be just your thoughts around subjective immortality, if you affirm it, because I know that not all process theologians do. And then secondly, this is going to be more of a selfish question. So like, if you were providing some sort of pastoral care to someone that is incredibly fearful of death, how would you try to assuage those fears from a process perspective?
Oh, see, that's high quality. That's high quality question. So the second question, Tim and Jake are going to answer. I'll briefly give an outline of process options on continued self-identity, just because this means I get to say something without answering said practical question. Process thinkers all believe that every event happens in the life of God. God doesn't forget things, so every event is objectively immortal in the life of God. It shapes who God is and provides a context for cultivating the way in which God values possibilities in the next moment to shape it. So that's one, objective immortality. Then there are people that were like, what about subjective immortality? What about like it? And this is a Marjorie Suhaki question. She's like, look, I get that if I exist in God, by the way, I've contributed to God in my own life, that may or may not make sense for my own life. But I know quite a few people, Jesus, who had their life snuffed out by an empire of injustice, or individuals who had their subjectivity wrecked by violation as a kid. And like, she starts going through a list and just goes, you cannot tell me that Jesus was telling the truth when he called God Abba, and The only option for flourishing that so many individual societies that move through time have is what occurred in the bloody bench of human history, right? So then the question for a process person is there ever a center of subjectivity for the fully retained, objectively immortal series of actual events of an actual entity? And Marjorie and others have made that. And so I would just say, like, so for process people, the question isn't so much obsessed about physical bodies as centers of experience, because it's the center of experience that receives each moment, the past, and your own perspective in that experience that identifies the self. And I affirm Marjorie as someone who's a Suhakian, obviously, like her intuition that subjective immortality is important. I don't know if it's true. That's why in my recent book, I said God's in need of salvation too. If this vision does pull out, it will require it. Otherwise, we shouldn't have taken the gamble on Abba, apart from the poetic robustness it allows one to exist in the world. But for all practical theological purposes, I'm very glad I said all this while Jake and Tim came up with amazing things they're going to say to your second question.
Jake, did you want to launch in on this one or what?
So, launching. A few things. I find that conversations about death and immortality, I find the idea of subjective immortality somewhat of a painful thing from my own perspective. I just can't imagine a perspective of subjective immortality that is joyful for me, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. But I shy away from it. But I also think that in a process theological perspective, there is this polyphilia, I think, allows for multiple ends. Like I don't like to imagine that God has simply one unidirectional conveyor belt for every single creaturely entity. I think that we can maybe talk about the ends of creaturely life in multiple ways, and that's something that I'd be willing to do. I also have this sort of Lutheran allergy moment that this is maybe where my tradition sort of begins shaping how I sense eschatology, is that Luther said, the moment you begin trying to think about where things end up, you're just all going to go mad. It's too much of a large thing. So we can engage in these speculative endeavors, but I'm not willing to reduce it to one singular thing because of my sense of God, and then because of also my sense that I want to retain some kind of humility in that. I will say that there is another thing that is really important for me, and that's to say that we tend to think about death as a terminal event and less as a process. And I think that's one thing that Whitehead gives us, is this sense that dying is a process that creatures and ourselves and folks are undergoing all the time. And it's a very complicated process in that. And one of the things that Arthur McGill, the theologian, it's one of the most undervalued theology books of the 20th century, to my mind, Death and Life in American Theology. He said that, and it was coming in with all the death research. He said that Americans love to imagine themselves as having this sort of pristine sort of immortality in culture, that sort of tan hustle of future. And a lot of Christian theologians love to sort of frame that as sort of the idolatry of consumerism or the idolatry of sort of self-preservation. But what McGill does in that book is really interesting to me. He says that actually, what folks who don't incorporate the process of dying into their lives as a cosmological thing or a theological thing, they actually make death hallowed ground. such that they don't touch it and therefore make it holy and end up in what he calls the American worship of death. And I think that there's something there that process gets us, where we can talk about perpetual perishing in an honest way. And there are pastoral moments in which that's appropriate and not. But I think that's where I'd start, is from the more theologian angle. I was a hospital chaplain, and I've been with a lot of dying folks, but I just find that those situations are all so unique that there's not a singular way of approaching it.
Can I ask Jake a follow-up question real quick? Because a lot of what you said made me think of that essay John Cobb did for the Harvard Theological Review on, I think it's like on the immortality of the soul. Like, I feel like they gave him a topic, talk about the afterlife, and he was like, I guess. And and I read it, and one of the things in it, he just says, is like the idea, like there's one thing for subjective immortality in the way in which there's a level of enjoyment that God desires for us to have until there's some type of, ultimate fusion for one's particularity, right? Like, so in his example, and he's like, this isn't surprising, is Gregory of Nyssa, right? Like Gregory of Nyssa is like, well, you have he's occupying, right, in an Orthodox vision, you have like these stages of purgatory, and you got like heaven and all this kind of stuff. But when the infinite flame has no difference between what it's inflamed, like he's like, I find that reasonable. Like at some point, if your connection to the ultimate is such that like what you would call the subject dissipates, he's like, I imagine at that point you're not worried about it. But I also think that there's all sorts of experiences on, like when you were talking about these different situations that each individual may be in, that he was trying to say, like, most of the time we talk about the afterlife, the assumption is it's one size fits all, and there's one key, right, that you're using to assess it. Usually really bad theology. Like, have you passed the true false test? But like, once you get rid of that and then ask the question, imagine the ultimate source of mystery is full of depths of love you can't comprehend completely. Then what happens? John, I remember him, I brought this conversation up to him, I think the first time I interviewed him on the podcast. He was like, well, Tripp, don't you think people just don't have much faith if they're worried about that? And I just thought, I would never say this like in Annie's question of like in a hospital room.
Yeah, that's not a pastoral care response.
But I do think it's really, it was real helpful for me, because his question was not like, what's the rubric and what are the options? His question was, who are you relating to? And if the answer is the one Jesus called zombie, he's like, well, I'm sure it works out. And I feel like that's like a different dynamic. Anyway, but when you were talking about the different ways people could see it and the different places that they could come in, after this particular experience. Anyway.
Yeah. Could I say something? This is one of my favorite topics. I think given my own cancer experience, it's death has been, like as St. Francis says, sister death to me since that. In fact, I've got beyond becoming and perishing tattooed on my arm. So with the skull. So anyways, so the perpetual perishing that Jake was alluding to, I find a lot of resonance in process theology with also the Celtic imagination, especially a thinker named John O'Donohue, who talks about death as a kind of birth. And if you think about it metaphysically, every moment is a death and a birth at the same. And you can't really pull them apart in process thought very easily. I mean, in the spatiotemporal analysis you could, but in the grand scheme, there's just infinite death, infinite, or sort of infinite becoming would be a better way to say that. And so, O'Donohue reflects on how he says death brings out the fire and fiber at the heart of beauty, and how ultimately the eyes of beauty outstare the eyes of death. And so for me, there's pastoral questions about how to address somebody has a fear of death and an experience of maybe a terminal illness or something like that. That again, I wouldn't launch into my axiology about that. But I do think that for me, I'm sort of with Jake in the sense that I'm more interested in objective immortality. I think subjective immortality is an opening that I would hold, because as a process person, you just got to hold open possibility, right? But in terms of the manifold beauty, which is the divine life, like the realm of value, which is this sort of consequent nature of God, which Whitehead says the value of our lives is preserved everlastingly. There is something there for me about the nature of beauty, as Whitehead names it, that I have found to be a balm for my own existential anxieties about death. And that said, I think another way I work it out too personally is, when Whitehead talks about mutual immanence as basically the nature of Cora, or the nature of the ground, what Meister Eckhart might call the Godhead in a sense, which is different than Whitehead's God of the sort of metaphysical relations. There's this sense in which I think the one way to name mutual immanence to ourselves is love. And that love is sort of an infinite oscillation for me, that is the sort of the place of becoming, as Whitehead calls it. And if we come from that place, and every moment of 13.9 billion years of cosmic evolution comes from this place of love, of mutual immanence, of relationality, and our beauty comes home to that place everlastingly, and that love is a ground for the becoming of the beautiful relations of this world, and trusting in that beauty is what Whitehead says is what, if we can trust in the efficacy of beauty, that's what creates peace, even perhaps the peace of passage, the peace of perishing, the peace in death. Then it is for me an encouragement, in a sense that the beauty of our lives and the future becomings of the universe beyond our lives live everlastingly in the mind of God, and that as we return to love, who knows what creativity will ensue? You know what I mean? I don't tend toward getting speculative about subjective immortality, but I will say that David Ray Griffin, who's a friend of mine and process theologian up here, he's just finishing a book on why subjective immortality is necessary for hope. So you want to talk about a process theologian taking a turn late in his life toward thinking about that, and he's reading James and some others on that as well, then that will be an interesting conversation. But it's fun to speculate about. But generally, I think this image of love expressing itself as beauty, and beauty returning to the relational ground of that love. For me, death is, and as O'Donohue says, that horizon, or God is even that horizon in which dawn and twilight are one. And so it's sort of like it starts to meld together for me in a sense there.
So, one of the things about that, Tim, that's interesting is that the afterlife or eschatology question, one of those places, like in the early church, how you dealt with Platonism and Christianity, where what is or isn't available in your larger philosophical picture is then shaped by how you understand the content of particular religious traditions, claims, right? And I think what Marjorie or David has been doing more recently and Monica, when it goes to in Making a Way Out of No Way, like there's a number of people that, if it's just like, oh, well, you join our team, you get in, they're like, subjective immortality, that's kind of a waste. I don't get the point. Like, you're missing that the main dishes of existence are your life. Like, there's no reason to be obsessed with dessert right now. But then there's the other side, is like the way in which if your vision about the ultimate is shaped in such a way that the vision's goodness demands something more, then the question gets shaped differently. And I think that, like, Tom Ord, who's on here earlier, like, I think came up with like 7 different process possibilities for eschatology, just because so much of it has to do with the question that drives you. And that's one of the fun things when you're conscious about engaging biblical criticism through different ways, engaging philosophy from a center that allows you then to gauge different sciences and conversations and such. But Tom is our next hot take, who like you're about to move across the United States of America, right?
I am. Yeah, I'm in Boston right now, finishing up dissertation and joining the faculty at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California this fall. So that's, I'm from Alabama, so I've never been on the West Coast for more than AAR in San Diego. So
Well, congratulations.
Exciting. Thank you.
That's exciting.
Your the tacos and beer are significantly better.
Well, I'm a big ale dude, so the beer thing's going to be a learning curve.
Oh,
so.
You'll figure it out. Also, you'll be able to be awake for more Lakers games, so that you can finally come around to where the real winners go.
I mean, I'm from the area of the country where professional sports all go to undergraduate institutions, and
you said
and
Alabama
compete for a couple of years. So.
Yeah. Okay. But say a bit about yourself and process stuff, and then you can get a hot take, because I don't want to get rid of your personal things just because I mentioned that you were employed, but like it's a rare thing,
It is
full-time employment with PhD. So you just have to celebrate it where it happens.
It is. I appreciate the chance to celebrate. I'm in the weeds of my dissertation right now, so I don't always feel like we can do that all the time. So I'm Tom Hermans Webster. I am a United Methodist pastor and live in Boston, PhD student candidate. I'm writing a dissertation on Norman Pittenger, who is a process theologian from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. He wrote about John Cobb when John Cobb was a doctoral student. He actually said John Cobb and Schubert Ogden are these two up and coming young theologians. You should pay attention to them. And then he moved to England in the 70s, and basically we quit reading him on this side of the Atlantic. And I was actually introduced to the Process Party, I think, in infancy. My dad was one of Schubert Ogden's students in seminary, and I was raised in a Methodist parsonage. Both my mom and dad are Methodist pastors. And I think I was just always taught that Wesley was a process theologian. He just didn't know it yet because the science hadn't gotten there yet. And so when I read Cobb's book, Grace and Responsibility, when I was in seminary, I was like, oh shit, this was what I was taught in confirmation class. But I think that when I really came to it, I was in undergrad, and I had a professor named Bill Myers at my college, who's a Dewey scholar, and he's a philosopher and does a lot of work with Dewey and Whitehead and Hartshorne. And he handed me this book called Thy Nature and Thy Name is Love by Tom Ward, edited by Tom Ward and Brian Stone, and said, you need to read this because you're going to stop having all of these existential crises when you realize that there are people who've been saying this in your own church family for generations. And so the talking about how do you hold this liturgical tradition and handing over, I was given process as a valid expression of my Methodist Wesleyan identity. And that's what drives a lot of my work. I'm really super fascinated in Jacob and I talked about this a little bit on Twitter, the ecological justice and the ecological theology that comes out of process. Pittenger, I think, this is my hot take, Pittenger says sacramentalism in the right sense is both natural to man and natural to the world, and is also the way in which, as a matter of fact, God works in creation. Incarnation and sacrament belong together. The two words are different ways of saying the same thing. Here, as process thought has understood, God and the world are indissolubly related. And my entire dissertation is trying to figure out that phrase? Like, what does it mean for sacramentalism to be natural to humanity and to the world? And really digging into, in my own work, digging into what that means for the Eucharist as a location and an event for ecological justice. I think the Eucharist should teach us who receive it to eat all of our other meals with the expectation that God's going to show up, and with the love and care of wheat and water and grape and soil that God has for it, and to love all the other creatures who we eat as much as God loves them too. And that should change how we experience food and how we advocate for food justice in the midst of climate change. So yeah, I'm big team process has to be liberation or else it's worthless. I got that at Perkins. I did my MDiv at Perkins. I'm one of those few non-Claremont at any point process people. I went to Perkins and BU, and I'm shaped by like a Hartsonian. But Karen Baker Fletcher and Theodore Walker Jr. taught me from the jump that we've got to be doing liberating work in order for it to be meaningful for a zesty future.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. That's high quality, hot take and provocation. And now I got to figure out if Jake or Tim wants to talk first. They can signal said desire through the unmuting of the mute button. And if they don't, I'll just start talking. Thank you, Jake.
I'm just eager here. It's really fun to see everybody's like in actual like virtual space and not just like on Twitter. This is awesome. I think one of the things that I inherit from the Lutheran sacramental tradition is this language of in, with, and under, and it's always messing with me. And of course, I grew up in a really small rural church of farmers who were sort of plowing the fields on most days of the week, sometimes even during the worship service on Sunday. And then we were sort of eating that at the table together in small ways on Sunday during the Eucharist. And so I think the sacraments for me as a practice, particularly Eucharist, but also baptism, I've never been able to see them as separate from my own ecological context. Like I can't actually separate one out to be something completely different. And the ways that sacramental eating sort of is a practice and recognition of vulnerability of divinity and ourselves with one another is I think a really powerful motivator. I almost chose a quote from Karen Baker Fletcher because I love Sisters of Dust, Sisters of Spirit, and the way she talks about it as she talks about elemental theology and the sort of the primal ways that we talk about materiality. And I saw earlier in the chat, there was sort of conversations about earth, wind, fire, and water. It's sort of like a Captain Planet kind of theology or Avatar. Maybe the Avatar is a more up-to-date reference or something like that. I don't even know what it is anymore. But like the ways in which spirit enwraps itself in these sort of inorganic realities, and some of which are organic and edible. Paul Tillich said, like theology is rarely considered the inorganic as a mode and locus of thought, but it's so probably the most immense space. And then of course, Whitehead gives a launching pad for that. And then of course it leads into this kind of sacramentality. I think the question then becomes, is there a way of talking about traditional liturgical traditions, or talking in traditional liturgical spaces that are practicing sacraments in very sort of older traditional looking ways? Are there ways of talking about that interactivity, that connectivity that allows a kind of empowerment for the renewable, moral, spiritual energy, as a lot of the eco-theologians talk about. I think one of the ways that it does is process, because of that intrinsic relationality, allows us to talk about how our sacramental systems are inherently always connected to those, not just in a positive way, but inherently connected to ecological injustice. Like water is dirty. There's microplastics, and yet we engage in talking about water as holy in that moment in some traditions. And so if that's the case, is how do we think about the sacraments as maybe Kathy Tanner's language of sacralizing practices that sort of reconnect and sort of try to stare into the woundedness of the earth with everything that we possibly can, recognizing that there's grace there. So I'd rather, like, I don't want it to be just like a nifty sort of sweet spirituality. I want the sacraments to be a bit dirty. It's body and blood for many traditions, and that's not necessarily just sustaining work.
That's awesome. It's awesome. Tim, did something come immediately to mind?
I mean, no, I think Jake said it beautifully. Yeah, I think, I'm trying to recall, I think there was something that popped in at the beginning, but then I got entranced at what Jake was saying, and I think I've forgotten it
happens.
Now. Yeah. So I'll pass for now, unless it comes back to me.
Okay, well, I'm about to pull Dan up here, and he'll be our last hot take. But I had one thing, and this might be a question for y'all. Can let me know what you think. What? Everyone just moved up on my screen. Now I'm trying to. There we go. Once Dan said yes, then it was hard to make Tom disappear. And all right, so here's my question. That is like out of that I was interested in what you and Tim thought, and y'all can say, Trip, this is obviously something you're interested in, and we should just move on. But when Tom asked about like the incarnation and the sacraments as in parallel, both of them function as ways in which the individual, the incarnation, and the communal, a collective, participates in the divine. And so the incarnation is a way of talking about where the intention and participation of the individual, the Christ, if you're looking at Jesus, fuses with the divine desire such that the divine insistent becomes existence through their materiality. In the same way, the sacraments are moments that invite us not just as a collective to represent those, but to participate in that same maneuver. And one of the things I find about process framework is that you have the possibility of saying things about the incarnation and the sacraments in ways that the Eucharist recapitulates both Jesus's full faithfulness to the one he called Abba all the way to the cross, and that it's at that meal that the one who forsakes and abandons and betrays is also invited in to this beautiful dance of possibility. And that's the meal we keep alive. So, but that connection of the incarnation and the sacraments have that individual communal factor. And that's one of the places in which a non-interventionist account of the incarnation then becomes a lens by which to re-see the sacraments and communal practices that's life-giving.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, Trip. And the one thing I forgot that I just remembered was, it's almost as if, to me, process metaphysics could be, if you take the Christian incarnation and the sacrament of communion, perhaps as an invitation for reflection, process metaphysics could be an image of a sacramental metaphysics, in the sense that every moment is a breaking open, and every event is embodied. You know what I mean? There's this breaking open of embodiment and the web of relations that for me is a very, it renders a beautiful picture of a way of seeing value in the breaking open of our world that we share. And I think, to hit at Tom's question, and I thought, like I said, Jake already responded to beautifully, that extends to all reality. That breaking open is a part of the nature of things, and that seeing that as soaked with value is perhaps, I think, a sacramental metaphysics, and so obviously you could read more into the Christian symbols and sacraments through that, but I just think that idea of breaking open this incarnational reality it's human and non-human, alike. So
I think there's something that you were saying there that kind of triggered a different way of thinking of it with me too. That one of the ways that Lutheran sacramental theology frames, and many traditions frame, say Eucharist, for instance, is around the language of promise, and I think that this is one of the ways that a process theological frame has something really interesting to say. That is to say that Eucharistic practice is one of those events where church gathers such to be reminded that the lure for love, justice, and mercy is present always, right? Sort of this re-articulation of the fact that there are lures for us to be discerning, and that discernment is kind of more about stepping into the confidence of taking those sacramental practices seriously than it is saying, like, I know exactly what's going on here. It becomes an invitation to courage, really, in that kind of frame.
Definitely. All right. So Dan Rosado, you have to say a bit about locate yourself in the process party, how you got here and such. Also, Dan's been around for a while. When did we meet? We met at Subverting the Norm, right?
Yeah, that's the first time we met in the flesh.
In the flesh, that was an exciting event.
It was
exciting gathering, and we were going to a live homebrewed podcast. I don't remember who was driving, but I just remember the whole time going, like, is Dan old enough to drink? That was before I realized that you just perpetually look young. And that night, Charlie, the godfather in homebrewed Christianity lore, had brewed that was the night we christened the Katherine Keller beer.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the Jack Caputo beer, and Jack and Katherine were talking to each other next to the kegs prior to when they showed up at the live podcast. Katherine was drinking the Katherine Keller beer, which was like 4.5%. It's a dark, bitter British beer, super delicious. It was one of those, like, you drink because you're watching a baseball game or something in the summer, and you're like, want something crisp, and drink the whole game and not lose your biscuits. Jack's was the Deacon, like homebrewed Deacon Structor Ale, was 9.5% saison, and Homeboy and like Katherine and Jack were drinking at the same volume, but Jack didn't recognize that the double level of alcohol was such that there's a high quality podcast. If you scroll back through, when about 15 minutes into a conversation with Jack and Katherine, Jack puts together that he's drunk. And even the edited version's entertaining. And I remember sitting with you when we rode over to the podcast, and you were telling me your story, and I was like, why, he's definitely not in youth group anymore, but I totally thought Dan was in youth group. And then the Caputo Keller beer set for its own moment. So, all right, Dan. Well,
I definitely remember that we were talking about on the ride over. We were talking about socialism and Bernie Sanders.
well, I'm not surprised.
Yep. And I also remember Jack Caputo becoming more and more orthodox the more he drank. So funny.
There are certain people that has that reaction. Some people get, more edgy as they drink. Others get worse. Like that Claremont, they call me a 4-beer Bardian. And I've never been a Bardian sober in my life. But
so what does Tim become?
Tim, let's just put it, he's more likely to hug you. I feel like you're just begging me to tell like intimate stories where we were just sitting there having pizza late at night. But I want you to tell us about who you are. How did you end up at the process party? Introduce yourself a bit, and then you're going to give us your hot take. Sizzle.
Yeah, lower your expectations. There's no hot takes here. But yeah, so my name's Dan Rosado. Live in Colorado currently. Stumbled upon process through your buddy Pete Rollins. He will not like this story. But I was having like my first or probably second existential crisis, decided to go full death of God. And I was reading Thomas Altizer, and I stumbled upon this book that he had John Cobb write in it, and I can't remember what book it was. And I read John Cobb's piece, and I'm like, wait a minute, I agree with this guy. So I start looking up John Cobb stuff, stumble upon Homebrewed Christianity, and the rest is history. Let's see, yeah, and met Tim online, still haven't met in the flesh on purpose. Trip, Tim and I talk about this all the time, but you probably don't know. Beer Camp LA at the hatchery. Tim was there, but I never met him. We were in the same, I have a video and I have like the back of his head in the video, but we never spoke because I didn't know enough about him to go and talk to him. And it was while you were performing karaoke, actually. I have a video.
Well, the best part about Beer Camp in Los Angeles was that John Cobb was speaking the day of Trump's inauguration, and half the people went to protest. And originally Rosemary Radford Ruther was coming, and then she had health issues. John's there, right? And then we're like, I can't believe I thought I was timing this to Rosemary talking during the inauguration of the first female president. Like, total backfire. John does like John Cobb vintage material, like where the people are like, I guess I could still be a Christian. And then somebody said, John, pray. And then John's like, well, would you be comfortable with this? And next thing you know, like, there's like 115 or so day drinking theologians, and everyone's walking in from the protest in the middle of it. John just like holds his hands up and starts laying hands and shit and praying. And I was like, oh, there you go. I feel like more people should have just asked John to pray about whatever was going on in the world. And then it was like one of those moments where I was like, I'd have to read 100 pages to get this much insight of what was going on in John Cobb's head. And yeah,
that was the day of the Women's March, is what it was.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, it was and the signs that people brought in, like even the out of towners came up with some creative. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to repeat them. I just already know, since Facebook said that just memes related to this event were political posts and I couldn't promote them. I'm sure if I say what were on those signs, thank you, Gregory Stevens. that I would get censored. So all right, so Dan, what's your hot take? You're the conclusion for the first process party. So
I
yeah,
know.
there's a lot
you
of
should have
pressure.
put me first. I know it's too much pressure. I really kind of wanted to get all of your takes, including yours, Trip, on how you personally, what you do with creativity, right? So creativity is supposed to be the ultimate of ultimates within Whitehead's metaphysics, and Tim would know that there's a critique out there of how Christian theologians, when appropriating Whitehead, start collapsing ultimate. So creativity is somehow within God, or some other thing. And I'm curious how you guys each handle creativity in your own work.
Okay, so does someone other than me want to give the why this question is really fun and it differentiates process theologian summary, or do you want me to do it?
Oh wait, and my hot take. Hot take.
Okay.
Before you answer it, my hot take is Trip Fuller is a process theologian. Suck it, guys.
Oh.
Whoa.
Well,
I know.
Strong language.
I know.
Okay.
Let's have Trip explain this, and then we'll
That's
decide
not hot.
together.
That's burning up.
Here we go.
Well,
I knew it.
Once Trip explain this, we'll get to decide if he's really a process.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I want you to know that after they told me I was passing my dissertation, this became one of the live arguments at my dissertation defense. All right. So in process philosophy, scare quotes proper, therefore, like principles that are involved in each moment of becoming. One is the world. One is God. One are the forms. One is creativity. Creativity is that which all things participate in and none of them particularize. It is the receptacle of becoming. It is the place in which the play of difference occurs. What is that play of difference? Namely, the inheritance of all enactments, the world, and the interactivity with the flow of possibilities valuated towards the eternal forms, beauty, truth, goodness, adventure, zest, peace, right? And God evaluates them. Or like if you were going with Orthodox process, something like the forms, God, world, creativity, all wound up every time you talk about anything, you have to account for all four. So like the passage we read earlier about you can't talk about the world without God, God without the world. That is a discussion, right, of the fluctuations of the actual, because God and the world are actual. They happen, right? So then you ask yourself, what is entailed in an actuality? Well, one of the things that's entailed in the actuality is the very place the actual happens, creativity. Another is the forms, the possibilities that frame the valuation of the actuality. That, at least somewhere between religion in the making and process and reality, is what Alfred North Whitehead thought. Now, there's a number of lingering questions. One, are the forms structurally eternal or performatively internal? Good question. I don't actually have like an answer I completely commit to on this, and I fudge it in the last chapter of my book. So if you want to pin me down on that's fine, but fluctuatingly eternal means that the valuation of the next moment is intrinsically affirmed by what just happened. Not that the eternal forms could even be constitutively defined, beauty, truth, goodness, adventure, zest, peace, apart from God's growing relationship to the world. Then you have something like creativity. What is the growing of creativity? Is creativity just inert isness, or is creativity isnessing? I think Whitehead opts for the second, which is why he thinks that God and the world are creatures of creativity. He's saying that the the generative possibility flux of creativity in the forms, in this erotic dance of God and the world, is the very place happening happens. And that teeming little possibility zone is where all the zest pops, right? And so then when you ask something like, how do you understand creativity in your metaphysical picture? It's a lot more difficult as a historically Christian theologian to answer than if you asked it to, say, a Neoplatonist, where the forms of the eternal mind of God, and then the world is the result of the eternal God free decision. So then when you ask yourself about the receptacle of being, that is dependent upon the free eternal without the world's decision, right? But if the cosmic movement is always already this fourfold entanglement, right? God and the world doing this, possibility teetering down and the receptacle coming up, then you don't get the same opt-outs to fit your theological doctrines in. So then it becomes exciting. That's my small summary of these 4 parts of Whitehead. I feel like it was above average, but honestly, I'm slightly inebriated.
I think that was process enough.
Well, I mean, what Tim, Jake, I mean, you'll have to re-ask your question. I forgot it once I realized I was talking about the 4 parts. But I know you want to know about creativity and such, but I always feel like the dynamism and the function of the two, once you get that, then the theological questions aren't as threatening. If you don't get how the creativity in the forms and the dynamism of God in the world, like if you ask, like, God's a creature of creativity. The other thing you could say is possibilities, the child of the forms. And like both of those sound relativizing till you get the orgasmic dance of all 4.
Yeah. So the question is around how you deal with creativity in your metaphysic or even in your theology. Because what I'm thinking is that I think a lot of people are turned off. I mean, there's many reasons to be turned off as a Christian to process. But one of the things is when you say that God is an accident of creativity, they're like, what? Ugh.
Well, the other thing too, that came to mind as Tripp was being Tripp, was that Whitehead says that there's an ultimate that's actual in virtue of its accidents. So that sounds like creativity is actual to me also, but only in virtue of its accidents. And so there's a sense in which the dynamism of God and the world in process with one another, they sort of, I think Tripp explained well the sort of choric reading of that in Whitehead's thought, but also, just as this sort of locus or this place of becoming. But for me, I think of it as, like, sometimes the easy way to say it is creativity is the process and process theology. Like, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the nature of becoming. Creativity is the engine of that becoming, but it's not. I don't need to necessarily place it in one of those 4 spheres, that Tripp was lining out personally. I think that because we have, the nature of an event, as Whitehead draws it out, we have to account for creativity somehow. And so I think any process thinker is, in fact, I mean, I know Keller and Faber would say this like pretty unequivocally, is like, you're a process thinker if you're accounting for creativity. And that's the angle from which you're thinking about reality. You know what I mean? Like, when it comes to other forms of Christian theology, you've got people who uphold the big O God that Jake's been referring to today, like, and they do theology from that lens. And there's like all these other omni traits, and there's this like, there's M traits, and like God's immutable and impassible and all these kinds of things. So they're reflecting on reality from needing to uphold a certain construct. And what Whitehead, I think, is doing generally is saying creativity as something that's actual in virtue of its accidents is getting rid of needing any abstraction you make to be the substance from which you philosophize or you theologize. And so for him, like, the theology emerges from the folds of creativity's becomings, you know. And I think for me, one way to say that would be that it's a living philosophy. It's a living theology. Creativity is aliveness. And, you know, when he says he's writing a philosophy of organism, for me, the creativity describes the motive, alive aspect of the nature that he's rendering. And yeah, so I think that for me, that's one way that I think about it. So I'd be curious what Jake thinks too.
I'd be curious what Jake thinks too, to be honest.
I mean, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't?
I think I say that with a bit of play, because I think I do go a little bit back and forth on this one. On some days I'm perfectly willing to go along and say that, fine, creativity is an ultimate. What's the big deal? Like, at the end of the day, and that might be, you know, in one of those deep senses of pluralism, that kind of diversity of ends needs that, perhaps. On other days, I think it's exactly what Tim's saying, is that any way for me to speak in any kind of speculative philosophical way about creativity is inevitably enwrapped and enraptured in the signatures of living creatures, which are always then entangled with God to begin with, in my mind. So I can scope out in a larger way, maybe, but I'm also sort of limited because I don't want to bifurcate out sort of creativity as if it's some sort of substance out there that that's sort of a different thing. And Chip, that was really exquisite. I think we need to like get that little excerpt of you doing the fourfold there. I do think the forms are performative in many ways. I wanted to go with that a bit. But other than that, I think I'm sort of, it depends on how much of a world mystic I am on any given day. Like,
can I ask you a follow-up, Jake?
Yep.
Okay, so one of the ways creativity functions, or one of the ways in different process trajectories creativity functions, like for the Christian philosophical theologian. Right? And so I feel like phrasing it this way gives you like a way of assessing how you would use something like the receptacle of particularities that doesn't differentiate particularities, right? So for certain religious traditions, recognition that everything one clings to and identifies as their own is a part of creativity, just like everything else they differentiate and have antagonistic relationship involves a kind of maneuver of enlightenment, right? Like where your clinging is finite. It has ends to it that there's a ultimate, reservoir to. And there are different, each religious tradition has a different way that insight comes up around creativity. And so how that shows up, right? That's a minority report in a lot of Christian traditions. And I know Tim, as someone that emphasizes the contemplative, wants to bring those up because I think they're more important today in a pluralist place than they were before. But also there's always this hesitation when that no one would use this phrase. This is a trip. The gospel of creativity, right? That all your particularities ultimately dissolve in the big receptacle. Like there are other things where you would never want that to be the case, right? The prophetic, energetic response in each moment is one where it's precisely the particulars in their particularities. It's precisely how creativity in the particular networks of relation shows up with violence and thriving creativity and like in remission, like that whole dynamic is a place where God's if you were using the fourfold structuring of the eternal desires of the forms, take sides, right? And we brought that up earlier in the quote from the End of Process and Reality, Monica Coleman's quote and such. I feel like both of those things are important for a process spirituality. One, like we all cling to shit too tight, and that screws us up. And then we don't even cling to the places God shows up the most, namely the underside, in communities of vulnerability, in friendships where you're open and honest. And so like the particularity and then like the universality of God, both of those have a important dynamic for a process spirituality, and creativity is important for both. But if you absolutize creativity in the ways a lot of process critics do, they misunderstand the way the four relate. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah,
I spent a lot of
That's a
time
book.
reading in the last year and a half in my house by myself.
The Hobbit hole.
In the Hobbit hole, nice and bomb building ready. But I do think the question of creativity is really important, because I think we simultaneously want to say something like the things you cling to and protect about yourself could impede you from being fully present in a life-giving way. And I think we also want to say something like the ways in which you disassociate with things that are entailed in you being you, places in which we don't acknowledge our privilege, we don't acknowledge structural racism, all these types of things are essential for being you, and we need to awaken to them and actualize differently. And both those things are essential, which are essentially the functions of creativity and God in the process quadratic. If that dialectic made fourfold, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it could be said from my perspective that we just get into trouble when we try to pull apart the one, the many, and creativity. That's kind of, we don't want to create a new dualism by overemphasizing. Like we need our subjectivity, our individual experience. We need to recognize that subjectivity is mediated by our relationality, the many becoming one in us as a creative expression or creative advance forward. And I think I would say process philosophers or process theologians take more seriously creative advance than other schools of thought. And that's why we can speak to it in the ways that we do. But if we only speak to creativity and lose the one or lose the many, we're off on the wrong foot as well. But another aspect of this for me is, I remember, I was in the Whitehead and mysticism class with Faber at Claremont. We were getting into it and talking about nothingness and the apophatic and all that, some of the things we've referenced today. And we got to talking about Cora and mutual immanence, and he said, I was like, how do you, if this is sort of pre-spatiotemporal or whatever, where do you get value? And he's like, the nothingness is creative. The nothingness is creative. The mutual immanence is valuable before it expresses itself creatively. And I thought, oh, okay. So because there's relationships all the way down, there's value all the way down. And even so, even as creativity emerges as this, I can't remember what Katherine called it in that quote we read, but this sort of fount of expressing ones who are minis. Like there's, there's something there that I just think if we can figure out how to hold it together in the dynamism or sort of interplay, I think we're doing process,
Awesome. I feel like Jake's about to unmute himself. Like, I can never tell when you're talking to yourself, Jake, or you're about to unmute yourself, because they are very similar performatively.
Do you want me to camp it up a little bit? Get there. I was videoing with some other folks, and my hair is at the point where I haven't had a haircut since January. So I either, with a baseball cap, look like a nice Major League Baseball player, or I look like kind of like an Einstein sort of mode. But I just need to act a little bit more. And that I'm trying to think through a little bit how we're talking a bit about the creativity piece. I mean, I think one of the things that maybe we're performing here a little bit is actually just the ways that people are very actually not used to talking about creativity, or at least creating talk about creativity, because it enters into this sort of not a redundancy loop, but just like almost like a sonic looping performance where you sort of enter into this kind of space, and it gets to that good philosophical mode. But there is, I mean, just connecting to Tim's point a little bit about the nothingness being creative, there is, of course, some more traditional notions of God and Christian traditions that go that way for God, right? Where actually the nothingness or the abyssal of God, whether that be for like Tillich or Eckhart, or the way I like it with my beloved John Scottus Eriugena, he refers to God as anarchos, right? Which is usually read as before time, but it's basically like the anarchy of God at the beginning, which is where Caputo goes with it, right? In a little bit of that kind of way. So I think one of the, I mean, this is one of the maybe more poetic ways to make concrete what we're talking about a little bit, is that where do you locate that that generational chaos, right? Like, is that something that's internal to divinity, or is that external? And can you even talk with those spatial metaphors? And I think I like the wilder versions of it. I think I do, just because they allow for a bit more untamed reflection about divinity than we would normally get. So I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm ready to sort of like give a more fully fledged articulation of that. Like I said, I go back and forth, and I think I go back and forth because I'm my first love was Tillich, and so that ungrounded ground language kind of is the place where my initial gut was to, versus the process creativity. But I think it just says that we need to figure out more about how we commit to talking about creativity in particular ways.
Awesome. Okay. So y'all can think of your concluding thought or reflection. I just want to say thank you for everyone for hanging out, for sending questions. This has been a lot of fun. And next time, I feel like this was positive enough to do a process party again. It was really cool that all three of you who said yes to showing up on a screen for the first time, especially knowing you're going to have to talk to me, but also talk to two brilliant friends of mine. Like that was really cool. My final, I think we should each have a final thought, but my main one that pops up after this is that my favorite part of the process party are how many really cool friends I've ended up with. Like, just like any niche, like once you're into it, like then you can talk to other people that are into it. in ways that you're like, oh, I know you have stayed up and read these things. I know you have been disturbed and asked these questions and all that kind of stuff. But it was like that. You had these, like this shared thing. Like when I go to Comic-Con and meet people that prefer Jane Foster as Thor, I'm like, I understand what you're talking about. I can't wait for the movie to come out. Like I've cried reading the book a couple times and figured out a way to get in a syllabus. So like the process has that with it. And that's been the fun part about this conversation. All of you that popped in and asked questions is I feel like that the tribe that asks things process has certain intuitions, shared experiences and such that I just find beautiful, or at least intoxicating enough that I enjoy being here. And the other thing is, thank you all for hanging out, because you got to meet two of my favorite people. Tim and Jake are both excellent human beings and said yes to me attempting to describe what just happened. And I think what happened was better than my attempt to describe it, because I'm not good at explaining ideas on text messages. I just keep pitching it to friends until they say yes, and they both were suckered in. So I thank you all for hanging out. So like Tim, Jake, do y'all have any inaugural process party editions? Because I'm going to send this video to a lot of our friends and be like, come on, like, look, it wasn't horrible. Tim and Jake survived. We read process quotes. We had people jump up that have been into the process, ask us questions, hot take style. This is just me vamping until one of you unmutes yourself to talk. I feel like there's y'all are both looking at me and it's staying mute. Okay, thank you, Tim.
No, yeah,
you don't want me to vamp for 15 minutes just for your closing thoughts.
No, I mean, I know that there's many of us who are venturing into the uncharted waters of post whatever, and especially in post-Christian circles. And if you are looking to, to tether yourself to your sacred canopy and still move forward and adventure on into ever more creative expressions of yourself and your community and your faith, I'll just that's what's happened with me with process thought, and I, like Tripp said, I just moving toward those circles of folks who care about the things that process people care about. I remember I had a similar experience that you did at Claremont, Tripp, where I was, I worked the International Whitehead Conference, and got to hang out with a bunch of the old process theologians. When you hang out with like 80 and 90-year-old process theologians in Claremont and you see what their life is like, and you're like, I want to be like those folks. Like, I don't care, like, if, what happens. All I know is like, these people are generous, thoughtful, environmentalists, activists, feminists, like folks. They're not like they're just beautiful human beings. And so I've experienced that to be the case the more that I've gotten to know the process community, including today getting to hang with you, Jake, on the internet. So I can't say enough good things about how, for those of us who are looking for a creative way forward, to be scientifically engaged, to continue to deepen our experience and our spirituality. I think there's just a plethora of options within, the process relational landscape for folks to find homes and to take root. And so I'm grateful for you, Tripp, and for you, Jake, and for this growing community, for sure. So.
That's so lovely. It's like I'm in like a very good glow of you all. So this is just fantastic. Yeah. I think and I didn't choose it today because I was sure that somebody was going to choose it. But the when Whitehead refers to God as the poet of the world, I think that that language was so so real to me in the sense that I'm someone for whom often the language of, and the disarranging language of poetry, and the way that poetry holds both these sort of lines and images, and also holds these tremendous fragments and gaps all in the same kind of space, and lures forth a kind of performance and reading of it in us in different ways. To see that as a kind of metaphor for a very embodied God, and I think of the very embodied way that poetry is done. It's the guttural sounds that people read in the bodies that they use, like that. That's divine to me. And to think about that as being something where poetry is spoken in all of these multiple ways in the world, from all different directions at once, is something that is so overwhelmingly beautiful. Like to be sort of glimpsed by that vision of creativity and divinity. And it's something that kind of reminds me that how silly a job I do as a theologian, like how small actually it is. And that's the sort of, I think maybe if that's one thing that I can say about process at the end of the day, is that I think it's a mode of doing theology that values the imagination and as something that is of infinite worth, and simultaneously recognizes its humility within that. And so I think, and if I can maybe move that into the community that you're all talking about, like people who are tremendously imaginative about how they're encountering divinity in community, and people who are also incredibly humble and fragile and human, rather than trying to sort of perform a theological text for an academic sort of rigmarole. There's different ways of doing that, and it makes me really grateful that and excited to see what kind of incarnation comes forth. To be excited about how divinity pops up in life and writing is not something that I think a lot of churches even have. So that's where I want to cultivate that more, and I want more people to cultivate that.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate both of your concluding thoughts. I'm not sure about Annie wanting me to drink Blue Moon in the comment chat. Like I don't know what has to happen for me to want to drink Blue Moon. No, not with an orange. No, anyway. Annie has a craft beer deficit, probably not as big as her theological deficit because she's into process, but nonetheless, Blue Moon's not a craft beer, and Calvinism's not a live theological option. So with that, we hope you enjoyed the first process party. Radical theology's overrated. Neo-Thomism skirts most of the big questions. If you're not a feminist, you're not a Christian. Black Lives Matter, and that should be the first statement of a prophetic response. But also, actually, I'm going to edit what I was about to say out in advance, because I feel like I just alienated enough people that aren't members of the process party already. But just remember what Marjorie told us earlier in her quote. Like, if you really want prayer to matter, go process party. And I will look forward to doing this again. Those of you that joined live and enjoyed it, you should all message me your comments so that I know what parts worked, what parts didn't. Give me your thoughts, all that kind of stuff. Y'all that listen to the podcast know who are the people who've shown up multiple times, the ones I'm most likely to join, talk into doing this again. But if you're here, you should definitely join next week for the book party release for Katherine Keller's new book, which is freaking amazing. Like, okay,
Yes.
so I know how I joked about how Jake and her both like write in ways that are like, oh, that's uncomfortable how good you're at doing that, and I don't know how I'd ever do that. Yeah, well, then you throw on top of that she wrote a book like basically taking Revelation and then was like, well, what if I just took it more seriously than the crazies and then put it in context of our global pandemics, the ecological crisis, and was just like, you can't handle how much I love the Bible right now. That's what she does in the new book. It's so good. It's just inappropriate.
Friday.
Facing the apocalypse. So you should be there. It's Friday. And you can look on the internet and find out where it is. But it shouldn't be hard. But anyway, thank you both for hanging out. And I'll look forward to doing this again.
Thanks for hosting, Trip.
I'm just glad Jake stayed up past midnight. Like,
hey, I stay up late. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm you know, like all the energy right now. So
good.
Talking with you is good.
Well, sometimes I have people on in the UK when my kids go to bed. I know they're asleep, and then I'm like, we'll stream for America. And they're like the whole time looking at me like I'm about to fall asleep. You're just like, whatever. Cha-cha-cha-cha-chow. I'm going to chop it up process style. So awesome. All righty. Well, I'll look forward to when I get to hang out with you both in person. But thank you all for hanging out.
Likewise.
It's been fun.